There are over 7,000 of them, older than the Parthenon, taller than the average house, built without a single drop of mortar, and we still don't know what they were for. 7,000 towers on a single island. That is not a coincidence. That is not a quirk of geology. That is a civilization-wide obsession, and someone built every single one of them. The Greeks saw these towers and believed only one man could have built them. Daedalus, the same architect who designed the labyrinth, the man who made wings out of wax and feathers. Think about what that means. The most brilliant minds of the ancient world stood at the base of these towers and said, "We cannot explain this," and that was 3,000 years ago. In December 2025, structural engineers finally ran the simulations. The result: these 3,000-year-old towers are more sophisticated than anyone believed, and the people who built them left no name. No written language, no preserved name for their people. No explanation left behind, just 7,000 stone towers standing on an island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. This is the story of the Nuragic civilization, and it may be the strangest cold case in the history of human memory. To understand what we lost, we first have to understand what was actually here. And the answer is going to surprise you, because what was here was not small. Around 1800 BC, something extraordinary begins on the island of Sardinia. People start building towers, not huts, not simple walls, towers conical, corbelled, rising sometimes 4 stories high. The simplest nuraghi are single towers, but the most complex become entire fortified compounds, a central tower surrounded by smaller towers, connected by walls with courtyards and corridors running between them. And they built these everywhere, one every 3 square kilometers across the entire island. That density is almost impossible to grasp, unless you stand on a Sardinian hillside and count them on the horizon. Now here is the first thing that will make you stop scrolling. These people built for 1,600 years. That is longer than the entire history of the Roman Empire, from Romulus to the fall of Constantinople. 1,600 years of continuous culture. And in all of that time, they never developed a writing system, or if they did, nothing survived. No letters, no records, no names, just stone. We call them the Nuragic people, but that is our name for them, not theirs. It comes from the word nurahi, which itself may come from an ancient pre-Latin root, meaning heap or hollow. We name them after the things they left behind, not after their gods, their kings, their wars, or their songs. Just the tower people, which is honestly the most haunting thing I have heard in a long time. But before we get to the tragedy of what was lost, we need to confront what was actually built, because this is where the investigation gets genuinely uncomfortable for anyone who still thinks of Bronze Age people as primitive. The towers are built from basalt, volcanic stone found across the island. The blocks can weigh several tons. They were cut, moved, and stacked without metal tools, without wheels, and without any binding agent. No mortar. Let that sink in. Every single one of these towers, 7,000 of them, has been standing for up to 3,000 years using nothing but gravity and geometry. For decades, engineers and archaeologists debated how this was possible. Sardinia sits in an earthquake zone. The Mediterranean has seen centuries of invasion, abandonment, and neglect. These towers should not be standing. And then, in December 2025, a team of researchers finally published the answer. And the answer is not mystical. It is not alien. It is something far more impressive. It is physics. The study revealed that the Nuragic builders understood something that modern structural engineers call tripartite force distribution. The towers are not just stacked rocks. They are calibrated systems. The conical shape is not decorative. It is functional. As the tower narrows toward the top, each successive ring of stones transfers load outward and downward, dispersing weight across an ever wider base. The corbelled interior chambers, those beehive-shaped domes built by overlapping stone rings, work in the same way. They redistribute vertical pressure into horizontal tension, which the thick outer walls then absorb. And here's the part that genuinely stunned the researchers. This was not a lucky accident. The proportions vary from tower to tower, but the engineering principle is consistent across all 7,000 structures. That means knowledge was being transmitted, taught, refined over generations. There was an engineering tradition, a school of thought, essentially, that kept this structural knowledge alive for over 1,000 years. Without writing, without textbooks, without universities. They passed this knowledge down through demonstration, practice, and memory alone for 1,000 years. That is not primitive. That is extraordinary. Now we need to pause here, because the engineering mystery was the first puzzle. The second puzzle is in some ways even stranger. Why did they build so many? What were all these towers actually for? Theories have multiplied for centuries. Defensive fortifications, astronomical observatories, storage facilities, territorial markers, religious centers. The honest answer is probably all of these things, depending on the period and the location. What archaeologists do agree on is this. The Nuragic was the center of Nuragic's social organization. The tower was not just a building, it was a statement. It said, "We are here, we are powerful, and we are not leaving." Which brings us to the second part of our investigation. Because while everyone was looking at the towers and asking how did they build them, almost nobody was asking the far more important question, who were these people really? For a long time, the default assumption was that Sardinia was isolated, a Bronze Age island at the margins of the Mediterranean, interesting but peripheral, not a major player, and this assumption turns out to be spectacularly wrong. In September 2025, a study published in the journal Science Advances changed everything. Researchers analyzed 48 bronze figurines, the Bronzetti, from 3 major Nuragic sanctuaries. These figurines are remarkable on their own. Small bronze warriors and priests, no more than a foot tall, with horned helmets and arms raised in ritual postures. But the researchers were not interested in their shape. They were interested in their chemistry. Using a technique called osmium isotope analysis applied to Bronze Age artifacts for the first time ever, they traced the exact geological origin of the metals used to make each figurine. The first thing they expected to find was local Sardinian copper, and they found exactly that. The island was rich in copper deposits. This was one of the reasons Sardinia was so strategically valuable in the Bronze Age. But then the results came back for the tin, and the tin told a completely different story. Tin is what you mix with copper to make bronze, and the tin in these figurines did not come from Sardinia. It did not come from Cyprus. It did not come from the Levant, the places every textbook assumes were the Bronze Age's dominant metal suppliers. The isotope signature pointed somewhere else entirely. The tin in the Nuragic Bronzetti came from the Iberian Peninsula, modern Spain and Portugal, across a significant stretch of open Mediterranean water 3,000 years ago. But the story does not stop there, because the osmium analysis also revealed something that the researchers did not fully expect. Some of the metal signatures in the Bronzetti pointed far, far north. Scandinavia. The bronze in some Nuragic figurines contains metals with isotope signatures consistent with Scandinavian sources. These people were trading, or at least receiving metals from the other end of Europe. Let that recalibrate your mental map for a moment. While Rome was still centuries away, while Greece was barely emerging, a people on a Mediterranean island were running supply chains that spanned the continent. Sardinia was not a backwater. Sardinia was a hub, a metallurgical superpower sitting at the crossroads of Bronze Age trade routes connecting the Western and Eastern Mediterranean. And here's where the investigation takes its first real turn. Because if the Nuragic people were this connected trading with Iberia, possibly Scandinavia, Mycenaean Greece, and Cyprus, why does no one else seem to write about them? Egyptian records mention the Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders and traders who appeared in the Mediterranean around 1200 BC, contributing to the Bronze Age collapse. Some scholars have suggested Nuragic Sardinians were among them. The horned helmets worn by Sea Peoples figures in Egyptian carvings look strikingly similar to the horned helmets on Nuragic Bronzetti. This is not conclusive, but it is the kind of coincidence that archaeologists find very hard to ignore. If the Nuragic Sardinians were indeed among the Sea Peoples, then a civilization that supposedly left no trace in history may have actually terrified the most powerful empire in the ancient world. Not a bad legacy for people with no written records. But here is the tension at the heart of this investigation. All of this evidence, the trade networks, the isotope data, The Sea People's connection tells us what the Nuragic people did. It still does not tell us what they thought. What were their gods? What stories did their children grow up hearing? What did a Nuragic mother say to comfort a frightened child? We do not know. We may never know. The silence is absolute. This silence is the defining characteristic of the Nuragic civilization, and it is what makes the third part of our investigation the most unsettling, because it is about what happened when the silence finally broke. By around 900 BC, the Bronze Age is ending. The Mediterranean world is in upheaval. The Nuragic people are not vanishing, but they are changing. The Great Tower building period is largely over, and new people are arriving on Sardinia. The Phoenicians established trading settlements on the Sardinian coast, then the Carthaginians. Then in 238 BC, the Romans arrived and declared Sardinia a province. The long Nuragic period was officially over. But here's what the history books usually skip. The towers did not fall when the Nuragic period ended. They kept standing, and the people who moved in, Iron Age Nuragic descendants, Phoenicians, later settlers, they kept using them. They adapted them, repurposed them. And in one of the most remarkable finds in recent Sardinian archaeology, they turned them into sacred temples. Not to Nuragic gods, to gods that the original builders had never heard of. This is where the 2026 discovery at Nuragic enters the story. And this discovery is genuinely new. At the time of this script, it has received almost no dedicated coverage in English-language media. Nuragic is located in central Sardinia. Archaeologists excavating the site in 2026 found something inside the tower complex that changed the interpretation of how these structures continued to be used long after their builders were gone. Inside the Nuragic and in the courtyard spaces surrounding it, they found ritual deposits, ceramics, animal bones arranged in patterns suggesting feasts or offerings, ash layers from repeated ceremonial fires, and small bronze votives. This pattern is unmistakable to archaeologists. It is cult activity, ritual, worship. The Bronze Age towers had been converted into Iron Age sacred spaces. People were performing religious ceremonies inside structures they did not build and almost certainly did not fully understand. Let that image settle for a moment. Imagine kneeling on a stone floor that someone else laid down, in a chamber someone else carved, performing rituals to gods that the architects of this place never worshipped. This is the human condition in miniature. We do this too every single day. You live in a city built on layers of history you were never taught. You follow laws written by people whose names you will never know. You use institutions designed for problems that were solved before your grandparents were born. We are all in some sense Iron Age people living inside Nuragic towers, inheriting structures we did not design, serving purposes that have drifted far from their original intent. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back to the towers because there is one more layer to this investigation, and it is the layer that most completely explains why the Nuragic civilization is having a moment in 2025 and 2026. The question of what the Nuragi were for has never been definitively answered, and the reason it has not been answered is also the reason it is so fascinating. The Nuragic people built their towers over such a vast span of time that the answer kept changing. A Nuragic built in 1700 BC may have served primarily as a defensive lookout and territorial statement. The same structure in 1200 BC may have become a storage facility for the bronze trade. By 800 BC, it may have been a sanctuary. A single structure, multiple lives, and no one writing any of it down. The buildings carried the memory that the people could not preserve in any other form. The architecture was the archive. There is something in that idea that I want you to sit with. The Nuragic people did not need to write down their history because their buildings were their history, and those buildings are still here, 3,000 years later. Now let us take stock of what we have found so far in this investigation. We know that the Nuragic people were sophisticated engineers who mastered the physics of stone construction without mortar over a period of centuries. We know they were a Mediterranean superpower, running metal trade networks that reached Iberia and possibly Scandinavia, while maintaining a cultural continuity of over 1,600 years. And we know that their towers outlived them, that later civilizations moved in, performed rituals, worshipped different gods, and built their spiritual lives around structures whose original meaning they could not fully read. But there is a final question, one that the evidence points toward but cannot fully answer, and it is the question that makes this case genuinely unsettling at a human level. Did the Nuragic people know that they would be forgotten? Did they understand somewhere in those final generations as Phoenician ships appeared on the horizon that the world was changing in ways that might erase their memory? We do not know, we cannot know, but we know what they did in those final centuries. They kept building, they kept trading, they kept maintaining the towers, they did not give up, they did not tear them down. And when the Romans finally brought Sardinia into their empire, the towers were still standing. Many are still standing today. 2,300 years after Rome arrived. They are winning the argument by sheer persistence. There is a lesson in that about the relationship between permanence and memory, about which of the two actually matters more in the long run. The Nuragic people did not preserve their memory through language. They could not, or chose not to. But they built things so enduring that 3,000 years later, we are still investigating them, still puzzling over them, still making new discoveries. That is not a failed legacy. That is an astonishing one. They built so well that the mystery itself became their monument. The not knowing is the tribute. Now, before we reach the final piece of this investigation, the one that connects all three threads, let us be precise about what we still do not know, because this channel does not pretend to have answers that the evidence does not support. We do not know the precise function of the majority of Nuragi. The debate between defensive, social, religious, and economic interpretations is ongoing, and probably will be for decades. We do not know the exact language the Nuragic people spoke. Linguists have found possible traces in later Sardinian dialects, words that seem to predate Latin and seem to belong to a distinct pre-Indo-European substrate. And we do not know for certain whether Nuragic Sardinians were involved with the Sea peoples. The helmet similarity is suggestive. The bronze trade connections are real, but the direct historical evidence remains circumstantial. What we know with confidence is this: a sophisticated, well-connected, long-lasting Bronze Age civilization built 7,000 stone towers on a Mediterranean island, left almost no written record of themselves, and then gradually became invisible to history. Not because they were conquered and destroyed, not because they abandoned their island, but because the cultural moment shifted. The writing systems of the Mediterranean moved on, and the Nuragic people, still there, still adapting, simply stopped being legible to the historical record. They became invisible not through destruction but through silence, and that in some ways is a more disturbing fate than conquest. To persist, to continue to be present, and still not be seen. Which brings us to the final and most personal layer of this investigation. The question that the Nuragic case forces every one of us to confront. And it is not a comfortable question. What are you building right now? In your life? At your job? In your relationships? In the choices you make about what to create, what to sustain, what to pass on? What are you building and how durable is it? The Nuragic people built in stone because stone lasts, but stone lasts without language. Their towers persist, but their stories do not. And that gap between the physical and the narrative is the central tragedy of their legacy. And this is where I want to be honest with you. Because the Nuragic case is not just about an ancient Mediterranean civilization that history forgot. It is about the fundamental incompleteness of the historical record itself. Every civilization that left no writing is a civilization that history treats as a footnote or ignores entirely. But the absence of writing does not mean the absence of sophistication. It means the absence of the kind of evidence that surviving historians chose to preserve. There are almost certainly other Nuragic civilizations in history. Sophisticated, long-lasting, well-connected cultures that left no text and therefore left no chapter in the books we were taught from. We simply do not know their names. That is a humbling thought. And it is one of the reasons why new scientific methods, isotope analysis, ground-penetrating radar, ancient DNA studies are so important right now. They are giving voice to the voiceless. The 2025 Science Advances study was not just a paper about bronze figurines. It was a demonstration that we can now read the past in ways that do not require the past to have written anything down. The stones can be made to speak. And the December 2025 engineering study, the one that finally explained how the towers have stood for 3,000 years, that too was not just about physics. It was about recognizing intelligence where we previously saw only accident. We have a habit, a very modern and very arrogant habit of assuming that intelligence arrived with literacy, that the ability to think clearly about the physical world began when people started writing it down. The Nuragic builders refute that assumption with every tower still standing. Every Corbel dome that has survived 3,000 years of earthquakes and neglect is an argument against our arrogance. And the Nuragic Cult Center, where Iron Age people worshipped in a Bronze Age structure, is an argument against something equally uncomfortable. It is an argument against the idea that we understand the things we have inherited. Those Iron Age people were not confused or ignorant. They were doing what humans always do. They were making meaning inside the structures available to them, even if those structures were older than their own cultural memory. And so are we. Every time you sit inside an institution that was designed for a different century, every time you follow a tradition whose origin you have never been taught, you are that Iron Age worshiper. The question is not whether we inherit the structures of the past. We all do. The question is whether we are honest about not understanding them, whether we can hold reverence and investigation at the same time. The Nuragic case teaches us that the absence of answers is not the same as the absence of meaning. These towers mean something. We just have not finished learning what. And in 2025 and 2026, we learned more than we have in decades. The engineering secret of 3,000 years. The trade route that reached Scandinavia. The cult center at Nuragic. The pace of discovery is accelerating. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of Sardinia are still ongoing. There are sections of the island that have never been systematically surveyed. There are almost certainly Nuragi we have not yet counted, and certainly sites we have not yet excavated. Ancient DNA studies of skeletal remains from Nuragic period burials are beginning to reveal the genetic history of the population, where they came from, how isolated they were, whether the Bronze Age trade connections show up in the biology. The picture that is emerging is of a population that was significantly shaped by Neolithic farmers who arrived in Sardinia thousands of years before the Nuragi were built, and who remained relatively genetically distinct throughout the Bronze Age. Which is remarkable, because it means that through all of those trade networks, through all of those centuries of external contact with Phoenicians, Greeks, Egyptians, Iberians, the Nuragic people remained deeply themselves. They traded with the world, they interacted with the world. But they remained Nuragic. Their culture, their towers, their bronzetti, these were not assimilated away. They persisted right up to the Roman period. There is something stubborn and magnificent about that. In a world that was changing faster than most Bronze Age societies could adapt to, the Nuragic people held their center. They bent, but they did not break. And then Rome came. And in the context of the Roman Empire, cultural persistence became a great deal harder. The Nuragic identity did not survive Romanization intact. But the towers did. The towers always survived. The Romans did not build like the Nuragic people. Roman construction relied on mortar, that revolutionary binding agent that allowed them to build higher, faster, and more ornate than anything before. And Roman buildings fall down. Not all of them, of course, but the point stands. The civilization that conquered the Nuragic people left ruins. The Nuragic people left towers still standing. History is written by the victors, but architecture answers to physics. Let us now return to the question we planted at the start. The Greeks said only Daedalus could have built these, the man who made the labyrinth, the man who built wings, the symbol of the inventor who builds beyond his time. Daedalus, in Greek mythology, is the figure who creates things that outlast him. His creations, the labyrinth, the wings, are both his greatest achievements and the things that ultimately define him in other people's stories, not his own. There is something deeply appropriate about the Greeks assigning these towers to Daedalus. It is as if, facing something they could not explain, they reached for the closest symbol of impossible human ambition they had. And maybe that is the most accurate tribute the ancient world could have paid the Nuragic people. We cannot explain this, therefore the greatest inventor we can imagine must have done it. The compliment is the confusion. So where does this investigation leave us? We started with 7,000 towers and no name. We found a civilization of remarkable engineers and ambitious traders. We found evidence of a culture that lasted longer than the empires that replaced it. We found that their towers were not just monuments, but systems, engineered solutions to the problem of permanence that modern structural engineers only decoded in December 2025. We found that their bronze reached Iberia and possibly Scandinavia, that they were not an island in the margins but a node at the center of a Bronze Age network that spanned the known world. And we found at Nuragic that the story did not end when the Nuragic period did, that their towers continued to generate meaning, ritual, and community for centuries after the builders were gone. The case is not closed. It may never be fully closed, but I would argue that the open case is precisely the point. It is the openness that keeps the investigation alive, that keeps us returning to Sardinia, returning to the towers. And it is what should keep you thinking after this video ends about the question I planted at the beginning. The question the Nuragic towers ask of everyone who stands before them. What are you building that will outlast the story you tell about it? What are you building that will stand on its own geometry, even after the words you used to describe it are gone? Because the Nuragic people could not have known that their towers would still be standing in the 21st century. They could not have planned for 3 millennia. They just built as well as they possibly could, and the towers survived. That is the final lesson of the Nuragic investigation. Not that we should build in stone, not that writing is overrated, but that the quality of what you make is the only argument you can absolutely guarantee will persist. The Nuragic people were forgotten for 2,000 years, and then they were rediscovered, not through a dramatic literary find, not through a Rosetta Stone moment, but through the sheer stubborn insistence of their architecture. The towers said, "We are here. We have always been here. You just stopped looking." And now in 2025 and 2026, the world is finally starting to look again, with better tools, sharper questions, and a little less arrogance. If you have made it this far, through the engineering, the trade routes, the cult centers, the existential questions, then you already know something that most people never learn, that history is not a closed book, it is an open case. And the Nuragic civilization is one of the most fascinating open cases in it. 7,000 towers, no name, no language, no explanation, just stone and geometry and bronze and the extraordinary human need to build something that lasts. If this investigation opens something for you, a question, a doubt, a new way of thinking about what we build and why, then this channel did its job. Epochal exists to find exactly these kinds of stories. Stories that history left open, civilizations that the textbooks skipped, mysteries that are being cracked right now in 2025 and 2026 by scientists with tools that did not exist 5 years ago. That is what we do here. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next case opens. Leave a comment below with the question this video left you asking. Every one of your questions is a thread worth pulling. And the next time you walk through a city, or sit inside an institution, or follow a tradition whose origin you were never taught, think about those towers on a Sardinian hillside. Think about who built the structure you are inside right now. Ask whether you understand it. Ask whether the people who built it would recognize what you have turned it into. And ask yourself whether you are building anything at all that might outlast the story you tell about it. The Nuragic people did not leave us an answer to that question, but they left us the question itself, carved in basalt 7,000 times over, still standing, still asking. Epochal, decoding the stories that built our world. We will see you on the next investigation. One last thing before you go. In 2026, archaeologists are actively excavating new sites across Sardinia. New Nuragic are being documented. New data from the isotope studies is still being analyzed. This story is not over. The next discovery could change everything we think we know. It could answer the function question once and for all. It could reveal a fragment of the Nuragic language. It could prove the Sea People's connection beyond doubt. We do not know, and that is the greatest cliffhanger in archaeology right now. Stay curious, stay skeptical, keep pulling the thread, because history, as the Nuragic towers will tell you, is never actually finished. It is just waiting to be asked the right question.